Have you ever been looked dead in the eye by the very people who gave you life, only to realize they see you as nothing but a depreciating asset? What happens when a devastating medical diagnosis strips away your supposed value as a woman pushing your debt-ridden family to commit the ultimate betrayal? Today's story delves into a modern nightmare that twisted into a dark, unbelievable romance. When 23-year-old Madeline's parents sold her to a shadowy syndicate to clear their bankruptcy, they thought they were throwing defective goods to the wolves. They never expected the immortal king to crown her. Stick around, because this is a story of betrayal, blood, and a revenge served ice cold. The ticking of the clock in Dr. Stephen Higgins' office at the Riverside Women's Clinic was deafening. Outside, the bleak October rain of Ashbourne, Massachusetts, lashed against the window panes, but inside the chill was entirely born of the silence. Madeline Calloway sat rigidly in the sterile faux leather chair, her hands clamped together so tightly her knuckles were translucent. At 23, she had spent the last 5 years in agonizing pain, dismissed by specialists who told her it was all in her head, just the normal struggles of womanhood. But Dr. Higgins wasn't dismissing her today. He was looking at her with a heavy, pitying gaze over the rims of his reading glasses. "I am so sorry, Madeline," Dr. Higgins said, his voice a low, clinical murmur. "The ultrasound and your recent hormone panels confirm it. You have advanced premature ovarian failure, severely complicated by stage 4 endometriosis that has ravaged the tissue. Your ovaries are completely non-functional." Madeline felt the air drain from the room. "Non-functional? So I just need stronger medication, a surgery." "No," he said softly, folding the manila folder on his desk. "The scarring is irreversible. You cannot conceive, Madeline. Not naturally, not through IVF. You are permanently sterile." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Sterile. In a normal family, this news would be met with tears, hugs, and the reassurance that a woman's worth is not tied to her womb. But the Calloways were not a normal family. Peter and Serena Calloway were the desperate, clinging remnants of local high society. Their company, Calloway Logistics, had been hemorrhaging money for a decade. They were currently $850,000 in the hole, facing multiple lawsuits and the impending foreclosure of their sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate on Maple Street. Their last desperate strategy to save themselves from absolute financial ruin had been Madeline. In Ashbourne, a town quietly controlled by generational wealth and shadowy private estates, marriages were business transactions. Madeline was supposed to be married off to the Vanguard family, a wealthy local dynasty willing to absorb the Calloway debt in exchange for a young, beautiful, and most importantly, fertile bride to carry on their lineage. When Madeline drove her battered sedan up the winding driveway to her parents' home, the dread sitting in her chest was heavier than the grief of her diagnosis. She found her parents in the formal dining room, papers scattered across the mahogany table. Peter was nursing a glass of scotch, his face flushed with stress, while Serena furiously typed on a laptop. "Well," Serena demanded, not even looking up as Madeline entered, "did Higgins give you the all-clear? The Vanguard matriarch is expecting a clean bill of health before they sign the preliminary merger documents on Friday." Madeline swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "The merger? It's not going to happen, Mom." Peter slammed his glass down. "What are you talking about? Did you say something stupid to their son, Madeline? I swear to God." "I'm sterile," Madeline blurted out, the tears she had been fighting finally spilling over her cheeks. "Dr. Higgins said my ovaries failed. I have severe endometriosis. I can never have children." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, freezing vacuum. Serena stopped typing. Peter stared at his daughter, his eyes wide before his expression hardened into something incredibly ugly. "Sterile," Peter repeated, testing the word as if it were a spoiled piece of meat on his tongue. "Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I know this ruins the Vanguard deal, but I'm terrified. I don't know what this means for my health." Madeline stepped forward, seeking a mother's embrace, a father's reassurance. Serena stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't reach out to comfort her daughter. Instead, she looked at Madeline with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You useless, broken girl," Serena hissed. "We have poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into your upbringing, your schooling, keeping up appearances, all so you could secure our future. And you're telling me you are completely empty inside?" "Serena," Peter warned, but his tone held no defense for Madeline. He was already pulling out his phone, his mind calculating their doom. "The vanguards will pull out by morning. We are bankrupt, Serena. We are going to lose the house, the cars, everything. I am standing right here," Madeline cried out, her voice cracking. "I just found out I can never be a mother, and you're talking about cars." "Shut up, Madeline," Peter roared. "You have doomed this family. You had one job, one biological function to fulfill, to save us from living on the streets, and you couldn't even do that." Madeline stumbled backward, the physical pain in her abdomen suddenly rivaled by the shattered reality of her parents' conditional love. She fled to her room, locking the door, sobbing into her pillows until her lungs burned. She thought the worst thing that had happened to her that day was the medical diagnosis. She was wrong. Downstairs in the dead of night, Peter Calloway was making a phone call to a number he had sworn he would never dial, a number belonging to the underground lords of Ashbourne, the Sterling Syndicate. 3 days passed in agonizing isolation. Madeline was confined to her room, treated less like a daughter and more like a quarantine patient. The meals left outside her door were sparse. Her parents refused to look at her when she passed them in the hallway. On the evening of the 4th day, a sleek black fleet of SUVs with deeply tinted windows rolled silently up the long driveway of the Calloway estate. Madeline watched from her second-story window, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Men in impeccably tailored charcoal suits stepped out. They moved with a strange, fluid grace that felt unnatural, their skin starkly pale under the dim outdoor security lights. At their helm was a tall man with jet-black hair and eyes that caught the light like polished onyx. He carried a silver briefcase. Madeline crept to the top of the stairs, listening as the heavy oak front door opened. "Mr. Calloway?" The man's voice drifted up the stairs, smooth as silk and cold as a morgue slab. "I am Alexander. I represent the Sterling Syndicate. You called us regarding a liquidation of assets to clear a substantial debt." "Yes, yes." "Please come in." Peter's voice was trembling, a mixture of terror and desperate relief. Madeline crept down 3 more steps, peering through the banister. Serena was standing rigidly by the fireplace, her arms crossed, refusing to look at the men in her living room. Alexander opened the briefcase, revealing thick stacks of bound $100 bills and a heavy vellum contract. $850,000. Enough to clear your corporate debts, satisfy the mortgage, and leave you with a comfortable cushion. In exchange, as per the ancient tithe protocols that your town so willfully ignores until it is convenient, we take the girl. Madeline's breath hitched. "The girl. She's defective," Serena blurted out suddenly, her voice bitter. "I feel it is only fair to warn you. If the syndicate intends to use her to breed thralls or whatever it is you people do over the border, she's barren, useless." Alexander's dark eyes shifted to Serena, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The syndicate does not require human cattle for breeding Mrs. Calloway. We require blood. A sterile vessel still holds liquid. Her inability to reproduce simply makes her a baseline commodity, fodder for the lower ranks. Her lifespan in the feeding pens will be abbreviated, but a contract is a contract." He slid the vellum paper across the coffee table. Peter didn't hesitate. He pulled a gold pen from his breast pocket and signed his name on the dotted line. He sold his only daughter's life to vampires for a stack of paper money. "No!" Madeline screamed, bursting from her hiding spot on the stairs. She scrambled backward, turning to run back up to her room, her mind fracturing with terror. The monsters of Ashbourne were supposed to be myths, old wives' tales used to explain missing hikers and unsolved murders in the dense forest to the north. But they were real, and her parents had just sold her to them. Before Madeline could reach the landing, 2 of the suited men were already there. They had moved faster than the human eye could track. One clamped a hand over her mouth, his skin freezing cold, while the other pinned her arms behind her back with terrifying, unbreakable strength. "Mom, Dad, please!" Madeline shrieked against the freezing hand, kicking wildly. Peter turned his back to the stairs, pouring himself a scotch. Serena finally looked up, her eyes dead and unsympathetic. "You owed us this much, Madeline. It's time you paid us back for your miserable existence. Alexander snapped his fingers. Put her in the transport. Madeline was dragged out of the only home she'd ever known, her heels scraping against the hardwood, the gravel of the driveway, and finally the rubber mats of the SUV. The door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. She was bound with thick leather restraints to the seat. The convoy sped away from the Calloway estate, heading north toward the forbidden territory. Madeline wept until her tears ran dry, the reality of her impending death settling heavily over her. She was going to be drained, fed upon by the lower ranks of the Sterling vampires, until her heart simply gave out. Her barrenness, her defect, had sealed her fate as nothing more than disposable fodder. The drive lasted for hours, taking them deep into a primeval forest where the cell towers lost signal and the paved roads turned to smooth, ancient cobblestone. Finally, the SUVs passed through massive wrought-iron gates, adorned with silver crests, pulling into the courtyard of an estate that looked like a Gothic cathedral merged with a modern fortress. Madeline was hauled out of the vehicle. Her legs were weak, her spirit entirely broken. She was dragged down a series of cold stone corridors that smelled faintly of copper and damp earth. They threw her into a large, cavernous holding room. She wasn't alone. There were about 20 other humans in the room, men and women, all young, all terrified. Some were crying quietly in the corners, others staring blankly at the wall. These were the debt payers, the forgotten, the sacrifices of a corrupt human society that fed its weakest to the monsters to maintain its own comfort. Madeline curled her knees to her chest, shivering in the cold dampness of the cell. She pressed a hand against her lower abdomen, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Defective. Her parents had sold her to the slaughterhouse because her womb was empty. But as she sat in the dark, waiting for the end, she had no idea that the very thing that made her worthless in the human world was about to make her the most coveted prize in the immortal one. For 2 days, the human captives were kept in the holding pens. They were fed a rich, mineral-heavy broth and hydrated with electrolyte water, fattening the calves, Madeline thought numbly. Every few hours, vampires in clinical white coats would enter drawing vials of blood from each captive, labeling them meticulously and leaving without a word. On the 3rd night, the heavy iron doors groaned open. A dozen heavily armed vampire guards filed in their faces, hidden behind tactical masks. On your feet, it is the night of tithe. The king will inspect the harvest. A guard barked, his voice carrying an unnatural echoing resonance. The captives were herded like sheep out of the damp cells and up a grand spiraling staircase. The environment shifted drastically. The cold stone gave way to plush crimson carpets, towering mahogany pillars, and massive crystal chandeliers that bathed the grand hall in a warm, deceptive light. Hundreds of vampires lined the perimeter of the room. They were breathtakingly beautiful, dressed in modern haute couture, sipping from crystal flutes that held dark ruby liquid. But beneath their flawless exteriors, Madeline could feel the predatory hunger radiating from them. Their eyes tracked the humans with barely concealed savagery. The 20 humans were lined up in the center of the room. Madeline stood near the end, her head bowed, her plain grey clothes hanging loosely on her trembling frame. A sudden hush fell over the room. The murmurs died instantly. The air grew thick, heavy, with an oppressive, ancient power that forced Madeline to her knees. Several other humans collapsed beside her, unable to bear the sheer weight of the aura entering the room. Through the massive double doors at the far end of the hall walked Damien Sterling. The Vampire King did not look like the monsters of lore, nor did he look like the clinical businessmen who had purchased her. Damien was devastatingly handsome, towering over 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders draped in a bespoke midnight blue suit. His dark hair was swept back, revealing a face of sharp, aristocratic angles. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Madeline's lungs. They were a piercing, luminous silver, glowing with an inner fire of a creature that had walked the earth for a millennium. He moved with a slow, deliberate lethality. Beside him walked Alexander, holding a tablet with the results of the blood tests. "A modest yield this decade, Your Grace," Alexander murmured as Damien stopped before the first human in line, a terrified young man. Damien didn't respond. He simply inhaled deeply, his silver eyes flashing. "Average. Send him to the Northern Guard barracks." He moved down the line. He paused before a beautiful blonde woman who was trembling violently. Alexander checked his tablet. "High fertility markers, excellent health, exceptional pedigree. The surrounding vampires murmured in approval. Highly fertile humans were prized as thralls kept in luxury to provide rich, life-giving blood to the elite inner circle. Damien barely glanced at her. Inner circle reserve. He continued down the line, categorizing lives with a single breath, a single glance. Madeline closed her eyes as he approached her section of the line. She was the final girl. She waited for the inevitable decree fodder, the feeding pens. Damien's polished leather shoes stopped inches from her knees. Madeline kept her eyes squeezed shut, bracing herself. The silence stretched. It stretched for so long that the whispering among the vampire court completely ceased. Even Alexander shifted uncomfortably. "Look at me," a voice commanded. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the marrow of Madeline's bones. She slowly raised her head, forcing her brown eyes to meet the terrifying silver gaze of the king. Damien was staring down at her, his expression unreadable, but a muscle feathered in his sharp jaw. Alexander quickly tapped his tablet. "My king, this one is defective. Madeline Calloway, acquired strictly to clear a financial deficit. Her medical records and our blood tests confirm 0 fertility, premature ovarian failure. She is entirely barren." I apologize for the insult of her presence in the grand hall. She was slated for the lower pens. "Silence," Damien cut in his voice, slicing through the air like a physical blade. He slowly lowered himself into a crouch, bringing his face level with Madeline's. He reached out his large, cold hand, gently grasping her chin, tilting her face from side to side. He wasn't looking at her face, though. He was looking at her veins. He leaned in his nose, brushing the skin of her neck. He inhaled a deep, shuddering breath. When Damien pulled back, his silver eyes were wide, the pupils blown completely black. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of vampires in the room. The king was showing emotion. The king was showing hunger. "Baron," Damien whispered the word, sounding entirely different coming from him. It wasn't an insult. It sounded like a prayer. What the humans of Ashbourne didn't know, what even the lower-tier vampires didn't understand, was the ancient sacred biology of the immortal race. Vampires fed on life force. In a fertile human, that life force was divided naturally, biologically diverted to prepare the body for the creation of new life. It diluted the potency of their blood. But a naturally barren human, a woman whose body had definitively shut down the reproductive process. Her life force was singular, trapped, concentrated entirely within herself. To a vampire, especially an ancient king, teetering on the edge of the blood madness that claimed old immortals, the blood of a barren human was the holy grail. It was a grounding anchor of pure, unadulterated energy. It was the rarest commodity on earth. "She has no ties to the earth's cycle," Damien murmured, his thumb tracing Madeline's trembling lower lip. "Her essence is entirely her own, unfractured." "My king," Alexander asked, nervously stepping forward. "Shall I have the guards remove her to the pens?" Damien stood up slowly. He didn't look away from Madeline. "If any guard so much as breathes in her direction, I will sever their head from their shoulders," Damien announced, his voice booming through the grand hall, absolute and terrifying. Madeline stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Damien reached down, offering her his massive ringed hand. "You were discarded by fools who could not comprehend your worth. Madeline Calloway," he said, his silver eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive intensity. "You are not fodder. You are not a thrall." He pulled her effortlessly to her feet, pulling her flush against his side. He turned to face his court, his arm wrapping securely around her waist, branding her with his terrifying coldness and absolute protection. "Prepare the Queen's chambers," Damien commanded, his voice echoing in the absolute silence of the stunned court. "I have found my mate." The Queen's chambers were a masterclass in ancient, terrifying opulence. When the heavy mahogany doors finally clicked shut behind Madeline, she stood frozen in the center of the room, her bare feet sinking into a plush midnight blue rug. The walls were draped in heavy silks of charcoal and crimson, and a massive four-poster bed dominated the space, carved from dark wood that seemed to drink the ambient light from the crackling fireplace. It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. A young woman stepped from the shadows of the adjoining bathing room. She looked entirely human, with soft, rosy cheeks and warm brown hair, contrasting sharply with the pale, statuesque predators downstairs. "My lady," the girl said, dropping into a deep, trembling curtsy. "My name is Clara. I am your assigned handmaiden. The king has ordered me to draw you a bath and tend to any physical needs you might have." Madeline wrapped her arms tightly around herself. Are you human?" "Yes, my lady," Clara said softly, keeping her eyes averted. "I am a thrall of the inner circle, but you are something entirely different. The whole castle is vibrating with the news. A barren bride. The king has not taken a mate in 600 years. Because I'm defective," Madeline whispered the cruel word, still echoing in her mind with her mother's voice. Clara finally looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and pity. "No, my lady, because you are perfect. You do not understand what you are to them, to him. When a human woman is fertile, her life force is biologically scattered, preparing for a child that might never come. Her blood is diluted. But your life force is trapped. It loops within you, growing richer, denser. To a vampire facing the long madness of immortality, your blood is an anchor. It is absolute purity. Your parents didn't sell a defective girl. They sold a living myth." The revelation hit Madeline with the force of a physical blow. The very medical tragedy that had ruined her life, that had caused her parents to throw her to the wolves, was the very thing that made her invaluable here. It was a twisted, dizzying irony. After a hot, jasmine-scented bath that scrubbed away the damp chill of the holding pens, Clara dressed Madeline in a flowing gown of deep burgundy silk. It clung to her curves, a far cry from the conservative, business-appropriate attire her mother had always forced her into. For the first time in her life, looking in the gilded mirror, Madeline didn't see a tool for corporate merging. She saw a woman. The door unlatched with a heavy metallic thud. Clara immediately bowed out, vanishing through a side servants' corridor. Damien stepped into the room. He had shed his suit jacket, wearing only a tailored black shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the smooth, marble-like skin of his chest. The sheer, suffocating aura of his power filled the room instantly, making the air feel thick and heavy. "You are trembling," Damien said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sent a strange shiver down Madeline's spine. He crossed the room with impossible, predatory grace, stopping just inches from her. "Are you going to kill me?" Madeline asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the terror gripping her heart. Damien's silver eyes softened, a stark contrast to the monster she had expected. He reached out his cool fingers, gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Kill you, Madeline. I would burn this entire continent to ash before I let a single drop of your blood spill on the floor. I have wandered in the dark for a millennium, slowly losing my mind to the endless centuries. And then you were brought into my hall, a beacon of pure, undivided life. My parents said I was useless." She choked out a rogue tear escaping her eye. Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, violent darkness. "Your parents are blind, insignificant insects. They sold a diamond because they were looking for glass. Do not ever let their poison echo in your mind again. You are mine now, and as my queen, you will want for nothing." He leaned in closer. The scent of him was intoxicating cedar night air and a sharp, metallic undertone of ozone. "But the bond must be initiated. I need to taste you, Madeline, to seal your scent as mine so that no other creature in this syndicate ever dares to look at you with hunger." Madeline swallowed hard. She slowly tilted her head to the side, exposing the fragile, pulsing line of her neck. "Will it hurt?" "Only for a moment," he promised, his voice dropping to a harsh, needy whisper. "And then it will be something else entirely." His lips brushed her skin, freezing cold before his fangs extended. The initial pierce was a sharp, stinging bite, making Madeline gasp and grip his broad shoulders. But then a wave of intense, euphoric heat flooded her veins. It wasn't pain, it was a dizzying rush of adrenaline and pleasure. She felt the heavy, suffocating sadness of the past 5 years tears pulling out of her, drawn into him. Damien groaned a deep guttural sound that vibrated against her skin. As he drank her unique, concentrated blood, the silver light in his eyes flared so brightly it illuminated the dim room. The ancient, creeping madness that had been slowly eating at his mind for centuries vanished in an instant, replaced by crystal clarity. When he finally pulled away, he looked down at her with a reverence that bordered on worship. He gently licked the 2 small puncture wounds, closed his saliva, instantly healing the broken skin. "My queen," Damien breathed, pressing his forehead against hers. "They threw you into the abyss, but you have just become my salvation." News of the king's new human barren mate ripped through the Sterling Syndicate like a wildfire. While Damien's absolute authority kept open rebellion at bay, the shadows of the ancient castle were thick with whispers. For 3 weeks, Madeline lived in a state of surreal luxury. Damien was fiercely protective, keeping her close to him at all times. He fed from her every few days, and with each exchange, Madeline felt a strange, intoxicating energy blooming within her. Her chronic pain from the endometriosis, which had plagued her for years, completely vanished. The sheer potent magic in Damien's venom, left behind during his bites, was healing her broken body, even if it could not restore her fertility. But not everyone was celebrating the king's newfound clarity. Georgina was a high-ranking vampire of the inner circle, a viciously beautiful predator who had spent the last 2 centuries positioning herself to become Damien's queen. She was a lethal politician, and the sight of a fragile, broken human sitting at Damien's right hand during the evening banquets drove her to a silent, festering rage. One afternoon, while Damien was meeting with the Syndicate's territorial warlords, Madeline was walking through the sprawling, glass-enclosed botanical gardens of the estate. Clara walked a few paces behind her. "It must be quite the adjustment," a smooth, venomous voice echoed through the orchids. Georgina stepped out from behind a massive fern, her crimson lips curled into a condescending smile. She moved with a calculated languor, her eyes looking Madeline up and down like a piece of cheap livestock. "Georgina," Madeline said evenly, lifting her chin. She was learning not to show fear. Fear was blood in the water to these creatures. "I was just reflecting on your unique origins," Georgina purred, circling Madeline. "It is a fascinating paradox, really. Discarded by your own kind for being an empty vessel, only to be prized here for the exact same reason. But tell me, little human, do you truly believe you are a queen?" "The king seems to think so," Madeline replied, her heart beating a little faster. Georgina laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Damien is intoxicated by your blood. It is a drug to him, a very rare, very potent drug. But drugs wear off, Madeline, and what happens when he builds a tolerance? You are mortal, you will age, your skin will wrinkle, your hair will gray, and eventually your concentrated little life force will dry up and blow away. You are a temporary novelty. Do not mistake an addiction for love." The words struck a deep, insecure chord within Madeline. It echoed the exact fears she had harbored since her diagnosis, that her worth was entirely conditional, based solely on what her body could provide. Before Madeline could respond, Georgina leaned in close, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Enjoy the silk sheets while you can, human, because eventually you will be nothing but an empty juice box, and I will be here to sweep up the trash." Georgina stalked away, leaving Madeline trembling in the humid air of the greenhouse. Meanwhile, back in the human town of Ashbourne, the Calloway family was discovering the true horrifying cost of dealing with the devil. Peter and Serena Calloway had celebrated their supposed salvation. The $850,000 had cleared their immediate debts. But when Peter went to the bank to access the remaining funds to rebuild Calloway Logistics, he found his accounts completely frozen. Standing in the sterile office of his bank manager, Peter slammed his fists on the desk. "What do you mean, frozen? I deposited the cash myself." The manager, a pale man with perfectly manicured nails and eyes that seemed just a little too dark, smiled thinly. "The funds were flagged, Mr. Calloway. Upon review of the liquidation contract you signed with the Sterling Syndicate, you failed to read the addendums. Clause 4, Section B." "What clause?" Peter roared. "The tithe of flesh clears personal immediate debt, yes," the manager explained calmly. "But the syndicate acquired Calloway Logistics as collateral during the transaction. You sold your daughter to clear the debt, but you also signed over your company, your estate, and your future earnings to the syndicate as a management fee. You own nothing, Mr. Calloway. In fact, you are currently trespassing on sterling property. Serena, sitting in the chair beside Peter, went ghost white. They took her, and they took everything else anyway. You traded a human life for paper, Mrs. Calloway, the manager said, his voice void of any empathy. Did you really think predators like the Sterlings would let you walk away the victor? You have 24 hours to vacate the Maple Street estate. I suggest you start packing. The Calloways had thrown their daughter into hell to save their empire, only to realize they had handed the keys to the devil himself. They were entirely destitute. Back at the castle, Georgina's psychological warfare wasn't enough. She needed Madeline gone. She needed the king's addiction broken. That evening, before the grand banquet, Georgina slipped into the kitchens. Moving faster than the human servants could track, she approached the silver tray holding Madeline's evening meal. Georgina pulled a small glass vial from her corset. It contained a concentrated extract of dead blood, the toxic, stagnant blood of a vampire who had succumbed to madness. It wouldn't kill a human, but it would violently taint their bloodstream. To Damien, Madeline's blood would taste like rotting acid. The revulsion would break his infatuation instantly. She tipped 3 drops onto the rare steak meant for the queen, smiling cruelly as the black liquid dissolved seamlessly into the meat. The grand dining hall was a spectacle of immortal excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flickering light over the long oak table where the highest-ranking vampires of the syndicate sat. Damien sat at the head of the table, radiating an aura of absolute command, with Madeline seated directly to his right. Madeline felt exhausted. Georgina's words from the greenhouse were a heavy weight on her chest. Was she just a living vial of medicine, to Damien a temporary fix? The human servants moved silently, placing heavy silver plates before the guests. Clara carefully set Madeline's plate down. The steak was cooked rare, exactly as Damien had ordered it for her, claiming she needed the iron to replenish what he took. Georgina sat 3 seats down, nursing a goblet of blood wine, her eyes locked onto Madeline's plate with a predatory intensity. Madeline picked up her silver fork and knife, cutting a small piece of the meat. She raised it to her lips. Before the meat could even touch her tongue, a terrifying concussive wave of power exploded from the head of the table. Damien's hand lashed out, moving so fast it was a blur. He struck the silver fork from Madeline's hand. The utensil embedded itself an inch deep into the solid stone wall across the room with a sickening thwack. The entire hall fell into a deadly, suffocating silence. Every vampire froze. Damien was on his feet. His silver eyes were entirely gone, replaced by a pitch-black abyss of absolute unhinged fury. His fangs were fully extended, and a low, terrifying snarl tore from his chest. He wasn't looking at Madeline. He was staring at her plate. His immortal senses, heightened by his bond with Madeline, had detected the foul, rotting scent of the dead blood the moment it breached the air around her. "Who?" Damien's voice wasn't loud, but it shook the glass in the window panes. It was the voice of a very ancient, very violent apex predator. No one moved, no one breathed. Damien's black gaze snapped slowly to the side, locking onto Georgina. The air around the king actually seemed to warp with the sheer density of his rage. "You dare!" Damien whispered, his voice dripping with lethal promise. Georgina's smug confidence evaporated instantly. Genuine primal terror washed over her flawless face. "My king, she is a human, a plaything. She is clouding your judgment." Damien didn't walk. He seemed to simply materialize behind Georgina. He grabbed the back of her head, slamming her face down onto the heavy oak table with enough force to splinter the wood. Georgina shrieked a horrific, unnatural sound. "She is my queen," Damien roared, his voice echoing like thunder. "She holds the only light in my dark existence, and you tried to poison her. You tried to taint what is mine." He hauled Georgina up by her hair. Alexander stepped forward, immediately his face entirely passive. "Yes, your grace. Take her to the sun pits," Damien commanded, his voice cold and final. "Leave her there until she begs for the ash." Georgina screamed, thrashing wildly, but Alexander and 2 massive guards dragged her backward out of the hall. Her wails echoed down the stone corridors until heavy iron doors slammed shut, cutting off the sound completely. The remaining vampires in the hall were rigid with fear. Damien stood panting slightly, his chest heaving as the black rage slowly receded from his eyes, leaving the piercing silver behind. He turned back to Madeline, who was trembling violently in her chair. In a blink, his terrifying demeanor vanished. He dropped to his knees beside her, ignoring the gasps of his court as their king knelt before a human. He grabbed her hands, examining her intently. "Did you consume any of it?" he demanded, his voice rough with panic. "Madeline, tell me." "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You stopped me, Damien. What was it?" "Poison," he spat, glancing at the plate with disgust. "Designed to rot your blood from the inside out, to make you useless to me." He looked back up at her, and the raw, unmasked terror in his ancient eyes shattered every doubt Georgina had planted in Madeline's mind. This wasn't just a vampire protecting his food source. This was a man terrified of losing his soulmate. "I cannot risk this again," Damien murmured, his thumbs smoothing over her knuckles. "You are too fragile in this state. The bond must be finalized. Not just me taking from you, but you taking from me. It will bind our life forces. It will grant you my strength, my resilience." "You want me to drink your blood?" Madeline asked, her eyes widening. "It will change you, Madeline," Damien warned softly, leaning in close. "You will not become a vampire. Your unique biology prevents the full turn. But you will no longer be entirely human. You will be stronger, faster. You will live for centuries by my side, but there is no going back." Madeline looked at the faces of the immortal court watching them. She thought of her parents who had thrown her away because her body didn't work the way they wanted it to. They had looked at her and seen a broken, useless thing. She looked down at Damien, the most powerful creature in the world, who was kneeling at her feet, offering her a kingdom and a crown. Madeline didn't hesitate. She reached out, cupping Damien's sharp jaw. "Do it!" Damien's eyes flared with intense possessive joy. He stood up, pulling her to her feet. He brought his own wrist to his mouth, piercing the pale skin with a single fang. Thick, dark, glowing crimson blood welled to the surface. He held his wrist to her lips. "Drink, my queen." Madeline opened her mouth and pressed her lips to his skin. The moment the king's blood hit her tongue, the world exploded into color. It wasn't the metallic taste she expected. It was like swallowing liquid lightning. A terrifying, euphoric heat tore through her throat and slammed into her chest. She felt her heart stutter, then roar back to life with a booming, thunderous rhythm that echoed in her ears. Her vision instantly sharpened. She could see the individual dust motes dancing in the candlelight. She could hear the frantic, terrified heartbeats of the vampires standing 30 feet away. The chronic fatigue, the lingering weakness of her humanity was incinerated in a split second. She pulled back, gasping for air. Her brown eyes, once soft and weary, were now ringed with a brilliant, predatory silver light. Damien caught her waist as she swayed, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across his face. He turned her to face the stunned court. "Behold," Damien's voice rang out, vibrating with absolute authority. "Madeline Sterling, your queen, indestructible, bound to me until the end of time. Anyone who fails to kneel will forfeit their life tonight." As one massive, synchronized wave, the hundreds of ancient predators in the hall dropped to their knees, bowing their heads to the floor. Madeline stood tall, the raw, ancient power of the vampire king coursing through her veins. She was no longer the defective daughter of Peter and Serena Calloway. She was the queen of the shadows, and her reign had only just begun. The transformation was not merely physical, it was a fundamental rewiring of Madeline's soul. For the first 23 years of her life, she had been defined by her perceived deficits: a failing bank account, a failing reproductive system, a failing daughter. But the king's blood had incinerated those insecurities, replacing them with a terrifying, unshakable confidence. Her senses were now razor-sharp. She could hear the soft, rhythmic hum of the castle's ancient generators deep underground and the subtle, nervous shifting of the immortal guards when she walked past them in the corridor. She did not burn in the sun like a true vampire, nor did she crave human blood. Her unique biology had synthesized Damien's venom, turning her into a lethal hybrid, a daywalker with the strength of an apex predator and the concentrated, pure life force of a barren human. Damien was obsessed. The bond they shared meant he could feel her emotions, and the sheer, radiant joy she now experienced was intoxicating to him. But while Madeline was healing the human world, she had left behind was unraveling in spectacular, pathetic fashion. 50 miles south, in a damp, roach-infested motel room off Interstate 95, Peter and Serena Calloway were hitting rock bottom. The eviction from the Maple Street estate had been brutal and swift. The local police, heavily bribed by the syndicate's shell corporations, had given them exactly 20 minutes to pack their bags. Now, stripped of their wealth, their country club memberships, and their dignity, desperation drove them to stupidity. Peter had retained the services of a sleazy, desperate attorney named Stephen Carmichael. Carmichael was a man who chased ambulances and corporate settlements, completely unaware of the supernatural underbelly of Massachusetts. Peter had fed Carmichael a fabricated story, a hostile corporate takeover by a shadow monopoly called Sterling Enterprises, accompanied by the forceful kidnapping of his daughter Madeline. "We sue them for everything," Carmichael declared, pacing the stained carpet of the motel room. "We threaten to take this to the federal authorities. Racketeering, kidnapping, extortion. These Sterling guys will settle out of court for tens of millions just to keep their names out of the press. We just need proof of life regarding your daughter." Serena sat on the edge of the sagging bed, her face gaunt, dragging on a cheap cigarette. "Just get our money back, Stephen. I don't care what you have to do." They drafted a legal demand, an audacious extortion letter, and sent it to the public-facing corporate headquarters of Sterling Logistics in Boston. They expected a team of panicked corporate lawyers. They did not expect the Queen. 3 days later, Carmichael arranged a meeting in a supposedly neutral location, a high-end private conference room in downtown Boston. Peter, Serena, and Carmichael sat on one side of the long mahogany table, sweating through their cheapened clothes, armed with briefcases full of hollow legal threats. The double doors swung open, but no lawyers entered. Instead, 2 towering guards in impeccable charcoal suits stepped inside, taking positions at the flanks of the door. Then Alexander entered, his dark eyes sweeping over the Calloways with profound boredom. Finally, Madeline walked in. Peter dropped his pen. Serena gasped, the cigarette falling from her trembling fingers. This was not the broken, weeping girl they had dragged to a black SUV a month ago. Madeline was draped in an immaculate, tailored, blood-red trench coat over a sleek black dress. Her posture was flawless, radiating a chilling, oppressive authority that made the air in the room grow heavy and cold. Her brown eyes were now lined with a faint, luminous silver glow. "Madeleine," Peter whispered, his voice cracking. What have they done to you?" Madeline pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, crossing her legs. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a god among insects. "Hello, father, mother," Madeline said, her voice smooth, melodic, and entirely devoid of affection. "I received your adorable little letter. Racketeering, kidnapping. You always were prone to dramatics, Peter." Carmichael, entirely out of his depth but puffed up on legal bravado, slammed his hand on the table. "Listen here, Miss Calloway. We know you are under duress. We have federal agents on standby. If Sterling Enterprises doesn't return the Calloway assets and pay a restitution fee of $50 million, we are blowing the whistle." Madeline slowly turned her gaze to Carmichael. She didn't blink. She simply stared at him, letting the terrifying, preternatural aura she inherited from Damien press down on the mortal attorney. Carmichael's breath hitched. A primal, instinctual panic flooded his brain, screaming at him that he was in a cage with a tiger. He slowly sank back into his chair, entirely silenced. "You sold me for $850,000, Madeline stated, looking back at her parents. "You looked me in the eye, called me a defective, empty vessel, and threw me to monsters to save your cars and your country club dues. We did what we had to do to survive," Serena shrieked, her maternal facade entirely shattered by greed and terror. "You owed us, and look at you, you're fine. They dressed you up in designer clothes. You owe us a cut of this new life, Madeline." Madeline smiled, and it was a cold, sharp thing. "I owe you nothing. I came here today to deliver a message personally, because I wanted to see the look on your faces when you realized the truth." She leaned forward, her silver-ringed eyes locking onto Peter's. "The syndicate did not steal Calloway Logistics. You signed it over in the fine print of a contract you were too greedy to read. You have no legal standing, no money, and no daughter. If you ever attempt to contact the syndicate or utter my name again, my husband will not send lawyers. He will send Alexander, and there will not be enough left of you to fill a matchbox." Peter paled, his eyes darting to Alexander, who offered a terrifyingly polite toothy smile. "You're a monster," Serena whispered, tears of sheer impotent rage spilling down her cheeks. "No, mother," Madeline replied softly, standing up. "I was a human. You made sure that didn't last. Now I am a queen. Enjoy the motel." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving her parents trapped in the squalor they had built with their own treacherous hands. The door clicked shut, severing her ties to her human past forever. While Madeline had conquered the ghosts of her past, the ancient politics of the immortal world were far less easily subdued. The Sterling Syndicate was not the only power structure in North America. To the west, controlling the sprawling, neon-lit ports of the Pacific coast, was the Umbra Coalition ruled by Lord Sebastian Foley. Sebastian was a brutal traditionalist vampire who viewed humanity as nothing more than cattle to be slaughtered. The rumors of Damien Sterling taking a human, and a barren one at that, as an equal queen had reached Sebastian's ears, and he saw it not as a romantic anomaly, but as a fatal display of weakness. To Sebastian, a king tethered to a mortal lifespan and human frailties was a king ripe for the slaughter. He desired the East Coast territories, and he decided it was time to strike. The annual Blood Eclipse Summit was held in neutral territory, an ancient sprawling chateau in the snow-capped mountains of upstate New York. It was a diplomatic gathering meant to ensure the peace treaties between the syndicates remained intact. Damien attended with Madeline by his side, flanked by Alexander and a detachment of their elite royal guard. The grand ballroom of the chateau was a tense, freezing environment. Dozens of warlords from across the continent mingled, their eyes constantly darting to Madeline. She wore a gown of midnight blue, a heavy silver crown resting in her dark hair. She felt their hunger, but more than that, she felt their judgment. Lord Sebastian Foley stood across the room. He was a terrifying figure, his face scarred from centuries of territorial wars, his eyes a murky, violently unstable red. He watched Damien and Madeline with undisguised contempt. "He thinks you are a vulnerability," Damien murmured, keeping his hand firmly on the small of Madeline's back, his thumb stroking soothing circles. "He is preparing to challenge the treaty." "Let him try," Madeline whispered back, her senses scanning the room. The ambush did not come with a declaration of war. It came with a betrayal. Halfway through the summit, as the warlords gathered around the massive obsidian council table, the lights in the chateau violently flickered and died. Emergency red strobes bathed the room in a bloody, pulsing glow. Instantly, the scent of ash and ozone filled the air. "Protect the king," Alexander roared, drawing a pair of curved silver alloy blades. But the betrayal was from within the neutral guards. 10 of the chateau's sentries, heavily bribed by Sebastian, turned their weapons on the Sterling delegation. They weren't using standard firearms. They were armed with pneumatic stakes laced with concentrated dead blood, the same toxic substance Georgina had tried to use on Madeline. A single scratch would paralyze a vampire, rotting their veins in seconds. Chaos erupted. The room became a blur of terrifying preternatural violence. Damien moved faster than the human eye could process, snapping the necks of 2 assassins before they could even level their weapons. Alexander was a whirlwind of silver blades defending their flank, but Sebastian was not aiming for Damien. He knew the king was too strong. He was aiming for the supposed weak link. He was aiming for Madeline. Using the chaos as a shield, Sebastian vaulted over the obsidian table, a jagged, dead blood-laced dagger in his hand. He lunged at Madeline, his red eyes blazing with triumph. "Let's see how the king rules without his little blood bag," he snarled. Damien was engaged with 3 heavily armed assassins across the room. "Madeline," he roared, a sound of absolute world-ending terror tearing from his throat. He threw an attacker aside, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Sebastian drove the dagger directly toward Madeline's chest. In her human life, Madeline would have frozen. She would have cowered and accepted her fate just as she had when her parents sold her. But she was no longer merely human. She was pumped full of the concentrated venom of an ancient king, and her barren biology had hyper-processed it into sheer, raw, kinetic energy. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. Madeline didn't scream. She didn't flinch. As the dagger descended, she pivoted on her heel with a speed that left a blurry afterimage. She caught Sebastian's wrist mid-strike. The ancient vampire warlord's eyes widened in absolute shock. A human should not have been able to track his movement, let alone stop it. But Madeline's grip was like an industrial vice. "I am not a blood bag," Madeline hissed, her brown eyes flashing with blinding silver light. With a brutal, singular motion, she twisted Sebastian's arm. The sickening crack of his ancient bones shattering echoed loudly, momentarily pausing the brawl around them. Sebastian let out a guttural howl, dropping the dead blood dagger. Before he could recover, Madeline stepped into his guard, driving her palm upward into his chest with the force of a freight train. The blow sent Sebastian flying backward. He crashed through the heavy oak doors of the council chamber, skidding across the marble floor of the hallway in a broken, humiliated heap. The remaining assassins paused, staring in sheer disbelief at the human queen who had just physically dismantled one of the most feared warlords in North America. That pause was all Damien needed. Within 3 seconds, the king and Alexander had slaughtered the remaining traitors. The room fell deathly silent, save for the heavy breathing of the combatants. Damien crossed the room, instantly pulling Madeline into a fierce, desperate embrace. He ran his hands frantically over her arms, her chest checking for wounds. "Are you hurt? Did he cut you?" "I'm fine, Damien," she breathed, resting her head against his solid chest, her heart hammering with the adrenaline of the kill. "I'm perfectly fine." Damien pulled back, looking at her with a mixture of profound relief and absolute awe. He turned to look at the doorway where Sebastian's lieutenants were frantically dragging their broken, humiliated leader away. The warlords in the room, those who had doubted her, who had whispered that she was a fragile pet, dropped to one knee. They bowed their heads, not just in deference to the king's mate, but in genuine, terrifying respect for the queen herself. Madeline had proven that her survival was not a fluke. She was a weapon forged in the fires of their own ancient magic. The defeat of Sebastian Foley sent shockwaves through the immortal world, but the true turning point of Madeline's reign was a discovery born of her own unique tragedy. In the months following the summit, Madeline worked closely with Dr. Stephan Higgins. She had leveraged the syndicate's vast resources to quietly extract the doctor from Ashbourne, setting him up in a state-of-the-art underground laboratory beneath the Sterling estate. She wasn't looking for a cure for her infertility. She had made peace with that long ago. She was looking into the nature of the blood bond. "It's miraculous, Your Grace," Dr. Higgins said one evening, holding up a glowing vial of blood. "Your body naturally acts as a centrifuge for immortal venom. Because your reproductive system is entirely dormant, your body reallocates all of its biological resources to processing the king's life force. You don't just absorb it, you purify it." The implications were staggering. For millennia, the greatest threat to the vampire race was the long madness, a gradual, unavoidable psychological decay caused by centuries of absorbing fractured, diluted human life forces. It was what made old vampires turn feral, violent, and eventually self-destruct. Damien had been teetering on the edge of it before he found Madeline. But Dr. Higgins had synthesized a serum using Madeline's purified blood, mixed with a synthetic binding agent. It wasn't a temporary fix. It was a permanent cure for the long madness. When Damien and Madeline unveiled the serum to the syndicate, the power dynamics of the global immortal society shifted overnight. Madeline was no longer just the king's mate or a powerful fighter. She held the monopoly on immortal sanity. Warlords from Europe, Asia, and across the Americas groveled at her feet, offering territories, wealth, and absolute fealty in exchange for a single vial of the Queen's grace. She instituted sweeping reforms. She outlawed the barbaric tithe of flesh that had brought her to the castle in the first place. Vampires were now forced to source their blood from ethical, highly paid human donors who knew exactly what they were signing up for. Anyone who hunted unwilling humans was executed by Damien's royal guard. Madeline had taken an empire built on Shadow's fear and human suffering and dragged it into a new, strictly regulated era. 5 years after she was sold, Madeline stood on the balcony of her grand bedchamber, looking out over the sprawling moonlit forests of the Sterling territory. She wore a simple silk robe, her dark hair blowing gently in the crisp autumn wind. Damien stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around her from behind. He pressed a soft kiss to the side of her neck, right over the faint silvery scars of his claiming bite. "You are thinking loudly," he murmured, his voice a comforting rumble against her back. "I was just reflecting on irony," Madeline said, leaning back into his embrace. "The human world told me I was useless because I couldn't create a single life. Yet here I am, holding the lives of thousands of immortals in the palm of my hand." "They lacked vision," Damien said fiercely, turning her in his arms so he could look into her eyes. The silver light in his gaze was clear, steady, and entirely devoted. "You are the greatest thing that has ever happened to this world, Madeline. You are my anchor, my queen, and my equal." He kissed her, a deep, passionate promise that echoed through the eternity they now shared. Far away in the bustling, grimy underbelly of Boston, the night shift was just beginning at a massive automated logistics warehouse owned by a subsidiary of Sterling Enterprises. An older man in a stained grey jumpsuit pushed a heavy mop bucket down the harsh, fluorescent-lit corridor. He was gaunt, deeply aged, and his eyes were hollow with regret. A woman equally worn and bitter-faced scrubbed the grout of the industrial bathrooms nearby. Peter and Serena Calloway worked 12-hour shifts scrubbing floors for minimum wage to survive in a squalid apartment. They never spoke of the daughter they had thrown away. They couldn't bear to. Every time they looked at the logo on their paychecks, a sleek silver S intertwined with a crown, they were violently reminded of their catastrophic failure. They had traded a diamond for dirt, and now dirt was all they had left. Madeline Sterling, the defective, barren daughter of a bankrupt dynasty, had not just survived the monsters in the dark. She had become their absolute ruler, forging a reign of brutal justice and terrifying grace that would last for centuries. There you have it, a chilling testament to what happens when you treat a human being like disposable cargo. Madeline's journey from a medically discarded daughter to the apex ruler of the immortal underworld proves that sometimes our greatest perceived weaknesses are actually our most devastating weapons. What would you have done in Madeline's shoes when facing her parents in that boardroom? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of dark romance and icy revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable dramatic tales from the shadows. Until next time, stay sharp and trust no one.